So picture this for a second. It is the mid-19th century, and you're looking into this grand velvet-draped room in, say, Paris or maybe Vienna.
Oh, yeah. Lots of incredibly elaborate facial hair, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely. High collars, mutton chops everywhere. And inside, these European diplomats are just literally carving up the globe on these giant parchment maps.
Right, just moving borders around, trading colonies.
Exactly. Drafting these secret treaties as if the whole world is just, their private aristocratic chessboard. But outside the heavy wooden doors of those chambers, there's this massive storm brewing.
A totally different kind of force.
Yeah, this completely chaotic, invisible force that's just tearing down ancient borders and destroying these age-old industries. It's connecting the most remote corners of the earth in this sprawling web of commerce.
To a world market.
The newly minted world market. And it doesn't care about their treaties or, their royal bloodlines or any of those meticulously drawn maps.
The tension of that era is just palpable. You have this massive clash between the antiquated political maneuvering of this deeply privileged elite and the just unstoppable, earth-shattering economic forces of early global capitalism.
It's crazy to think about.
It really is. I mean, we are looking at a period where the entire blueprint of our modern hyper-connected world was drawn in real time, and often in blood and ink.
And that tension, that exact clash, is our territory today. We are exploring the really profound and complex intersection of foreign policy, diplomacy, and the world market.
It's a huge topic.
Massive. And to do this, we are looking through a very specific historical lens. We're drawing our sources today from the Marx and Engels collected works, which is often just referred to as the MECW.
Right.
We're sifting through just a mountain of material here. We're talking their sprawling journalistic output, dense economic manuscripts, private letters, and this spans from the 1840s all the way to the 1890s.
Which is, I think, a surprise to some people. We often think of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels purely as theorists of domestic class struggle, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
But you have this classic image of factory workers squaring off against mill owners in industrial England. But diving into their journalism, I mean, it really reveals them as these obsessive, highly critical analysts of geopolitics.
They were constantly watching the world map.
Oh, yeah. They were watching the world market become this ultimate arena where all the internal contradictions of capitalism were just erupting onto a global stage.
Right. And as we navigate this massive stack of historical texts with you, I want to be completely upfront about our approach here. Because the writings of Marx and Engels are, well, by their very nature, they are highly politically charged.
To say the least.
Right. They deal with revolutionary theory, economics, and these really fierce critiques of 19th century geopolitics. So our goal here today is not to take any political sides or, endorse the viewpoints of the original authors.
No, not at all.
We are just stepping into this material as your impartial guides. We want to unpack the factual contents, the historical events they were observing, and the underlying logic of their arguments exactly as they exist in the source material.
Yeah, we're basically reading these texts as a historical blueprint. We want to understand how they viewed the changing world, how they exposed the often really cynical diplomacy of the European great powers,
and how they envisioned a completely new internationalist foreign policy for the working class.
It's really an exercise in deep comprehension. Because to understand their geopolitical conclusions, we have to start with the foundation they built everything else upon.
The economic base.
Exactly. Before we can even begin to understand the diplomatic chess match of the 19th century, we have to understand the board they were playing on. We have to look at the engine driving this newly globalized world market.
So let's get right into the mechanics of that engine. According to the texts, capitalism is fundamentally incapable of being a static system. Like it cannot reach a state of equilibrium and just sit there.
No, it's constantly moving.
Right. The sources describe an inherent structural drive for something called surplus value. And I want to break down what that actually means mechanically, because it drives the entire global expansion they're talking about.
Yeah, that's crucial.
So in their analysis, a capitalist invests money to buy materials and labor, produces a commodity, and then sells it for more than that initial investment. That extra profit is the surplus value.
Right.
But the capitalist can't just put that profit under a mattress. Because they are in fierce competition with other capitalists, they're forced to reinvest that surplus value into better machinery, larger factories, more raw materials, just to stay in business.
And that structural compulsion is everything. Capital must constantly expand to survive. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, is structurally required to find a constantly expanding market for its ever-increasing volume of products.
It just never stops.
Never. And the sources describe this phenomenon in incredibly vivid, almost predatory terms. They write that the need of a constantly expanding market chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Yeah, they are compelled to nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, and establish connections everywhere.
And in the process of establishing those connections everywhere, they're completely upending the old world order. The texts highlight how all these old established national industries are just completely dislodged by new industries.
Right. They get swept away.
Exactly. These new globalized industries no longer rely on indigenous raw materials. Suddenly, they are drawing raw materials from the remotest zones of the earth. So you have like cotton grown in India or the American South, and it's feeding textile mills in Lancashire, England.
And the consumption side changes just as drastically, too. Products are no longer just consumed at home. They're consumed in every quarter of the globe. And Marx and Engels analyze this as a profoundly dualistic process.
What do you mean by dualistic?
Well, on one hand, it was incredibly destructive. It completely ruined local artisans who couldn't compete with mass-produced goods. It shattered traditional self-sufficient ways of life. And it brought immense physical suffering and exploitation to colonized regions.
Which is awful.
Right. But, and this is a really crucial nuance in their theoretical framework, they also viewed this violent globalization as historically necessary.
I actually want to isolate that idea for a second, of it being historically necessary, because at first glance, that sounds totally contradictory to their whole critique of capitalism.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah.
Right. But the logic here is that before this massive expansion, human societies were largely isolated. You had local seclusion, self-sufficiency. Capitalism, for all its absolute brutality, smashes that isolation and forces humanity into a universal interdependence of nations.
It builds a global metabolism.
A global metabolism. I like that. And the connective tissue of that metabolism is what they refer to as world money.
Yes. And to understand world money, you have to consider how trade functioned previously. When you have a local market, you trade in local currency, which is largely based on trust in a local sovereign or a local government.
Like trusting the king whose face is on the coin.
Exactly. But once you step onto the world market, trading across vast oceans and hostile borders, you need a universal equivalent of value that everyone, everywhere, inherently trusts.
Ah, so gold and silver.
Gold and silver step into this role. They become the universal language of price. And this transformation turns the commodity owner, the merchant, into a cosmopolitan.
Now, when I hear the word cosmopolitan, it usually implies someone, cultured, well-traveled, maybe speaks a few languages.
Right, sipping espresso in Paris or something.
Exactly. But in this economic context, they mean someone whose loyalties are entirely dictated by the ledger. The sources note that commodities are completely indifferent to religious, political, national, or linguistic barriers.
They don't care about any of that.
No. To a merchant operating on the world market, a gold sovereign minted in London holds the exact same value as an American eagle coin or a French Napoleon. The universal language of price strips away traditional prejudices, and it replaces them with just a singular focus on exchange value.
Which introduces a massive structural vulnerability into human civilization. We've moved from localized economies to this deeply interconnected global system, and that fundamentally changes the nature of economic crises.
Think of it like this. Historically, human societies operated like a bunch of separate, independent nervous systems. If there was a terrible crop failure in some isolated village in Prussia, it was a profound tragedy for that village.
But the tragedy stayed local.
Right. The rest of the world didn't feel it. But the world market wires all those separate villages and nations together into one giant, highly sensitive global nervous system.
That's a great analogy.
The telegraph lines are the nerves, the shipping lanes are the arteries, and gold is the blood pumping through it. And because everything is connected, a sudden financial panic on the London Stock Exchange sends an immediate spasm through the entire globe.
Yeah.
It causes a textile factory to abruptly close in Germany, throwing hundreds out of work. Or it artificially crashes the price of grain, exacerbating a famine in India.
And the mechanism driving these global spasms is what Marxist theory calls the crisis of overproduction. And this is a uniquely capitalist phenomenon.
Because before capitalism, crises were about not having enough, right?
Exactly. In previous historical epochs, crises were caused by underproduction. A drought, a plague, a failure to produce enough food to survive. But because production under capitalism is completely unregulated, it's driven entirely by blind competition and the pursuit of individual profit rather than a coordinated plan of what society actually needs. The system periodically chokes on its own immense productivity.
So they literally make too much stuff.
The capitalists produce too much for the market to absorb at a profit.
Which is wild. And it's not that they've produced too much for what people actually need to live. It's that they've produced too many goods for the working class to actually afford to buy, given that their wages are kept as low as possible to maximize that surplus value we talked about earlier.
That is the core contradiction. You nailed it. And because of the world market, these crises of overproduction are no longer local anomalies. They burst onto the world market simultaneously.
Like a shockwave.
Yeah. Marx spent years in the British Museum obsessively analyzing global trade data, and he mapped the cyclical nature of these economic crises, noting how they arrived almost like clockwork every 10 years or so.
Just boom, boom, boom.
Right. He predicted that a crisis originating in English industry would inevitably lead to overspeculation and collapse in other countries. The sources highlight the 1857 economic crisis as a prime illustration of this.
Did I get that one play out?
Well, it started in the United States with failing railroads, right? But it jumped the Atlantic to hit British banks and then swept entirely through Europe. It proved that the global nervous system was fully operational and, honestly, highly unstable.
So if the system is prone to these massive, destructive global spasms, the obvious question is how Marx and Engels envisioned humanity moving past it. And their conclusion rests heavily on this very interconnectedness.
Yes.
They argue that the world market was the absolute, indispensable prerequisite for a socialist revolution.
Because they recognize that capitalism, by endlessly chasing markets across the globe, binds the fate of all nations together. In doing so, it creates a new global class, the proletariat, the modern working class, whose labor creates that surplus value.
Right.
The texts argue that because capital operates globally, the proletariat can only truly exist world historically. Emancipation from the system cannot just be a local phenomenon.
Because, if workers in one single country manage to take control of their economy, they are still entirely surrounded by a global capitalist market.
Exactly.
The global forces of capital can simply isolate them, blockade them, or use the wealth extracted from other parts of the world to crush them militarily. So for Marx and Engels, the revolution had to be as international as the world market itself, because the productive forces they wanted to liberate were already inherently global.
So we have the economic base established here. We have an expanding, unstable global board where the economic fates of all nations are intertwined. But governments couldn't just sit passively behind their borders and watch this happen.
No, they had to react.
The states of Europe had to actively fight for supremacy, for control of trade routes, and for the preservation of their own domestic power. And this pulls us directly into the dark art of 19th century diplomacy.
Okay, so to understand the diplomatic landscape Marx and Engels were critiquing, we really need to look at the system established by the 1815 Congress of Vienna. The context here is crucial. Very. The Congress of Vienna was this massive peace conference held after the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. The victorious monarchs and aristocrats of Europe gathered together and essentially tried to hit a giant undo button on the French Revolution.
They wanted to pretend it never happened.
Yeah, they wanted to wipe away the ideas of republicanism, democracy, national liberation, just put the genie back in the bottle.
Their goal was to restore the old aristocratic order and establish a rigid balance of power. The idea was to prevent any single nation from dominating Europe, but more importantly, to prevent any future revolutions from threatening their thrones.
Right.
And Marx and Engels viewed this entire diplomatic architecture as a decrepit, deeply reactionary obstacle to human progress. It was basically a cartel of kings trying to hold back the tide of historical economic development.
And the sources outline how this cartel was managed by 5 great powers. We're talking Britain, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. They were the ones drawing the borders and making the secret treaties.
Well, it's in the velvet-draped room.
Exactly. But Marx and Engels introduced this really fascinating conceptual shift in their journalism. They argued there was actually a 6th power operating in Europe, one that absolutely terrified the other 5.
And that 6th power was the European Revolution. It was the underlying, ever-present threat of popular uprisings, democratic movements, and working-class rebellions.
It was like a ghost haunting all their meetings.
Right. The great powers were constantly looking over their shoulders at the simmering threat. If you look at how Marx and Engels analyzed the specific geopolitical maneuvers of the major players, you see that almost everything these governments did was geared either toward gaining economic dominance on the world market or toward violently suppressing that sixth power.
Okay, so let's break down the specific players here, starting with Tsarist Russia. The sources consistently refer to Russia as the gendarme of Europe, the ultimate brutally repressive police force.
Yeah, Tsarist Russia was a massive autocracy. Its economy was quite backward, still heavily reliant on millions of unserved peasants, but it possessed a colossal standing army.
Huge.
And Marx and Engels saw Tsarism as the absolute bulwark of European reaction. Russian diplomacy was relentless and highly deceptive. It heavily utilized pan-Slavist propaganda, positioning the Tsar as the, paternal protector of all Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe.
Like a big brother.
Right, but using this as a pretext to expand its empire into the Balkans and carve up the declining Ottoman Empire.
But while pretending to be a liberator in the Balkans, Russia was simultaneously acting as the chief executioner of actual national liberation movements elsewhere.
Oh, absolutely.
When the Polish people rose up against Russian occupation, the Tsar completely crushed them. When the Hungarian Revolution of 1849 threatened the Austrian Empire, the Tsar sent hundreds of thousands of Russian troops across the border to violently drown the Hungarian Republic in blood. And this was purely to maintain that conservative balance of power.
Then you have Bonapartist France, led by Napoleon III.
The nephew of the original Napoleon.
Yes. And he had managed to get himself elected president of the French Republic, only to eventually launch a coup d'etat, kill the republic, and declare himself emperor. Marx and Engels had a particular disdain for him.
They really did not like him.
No. They analyzed Bonapartism as a highly unstable regime of adventurers. It was propped up by a mountain of state debt, rampant corruption, and immense police repression.
And because Napoleon III had usurped power and lacked genuine legitimacy, and because he faced massive domestic poverty and this restless, organizing working class in Paris, his regime was constantly teetering on the edge.
Very fragile.
So to survive, he desperately needed to manufacture glory. He constantly required foreign military adventures just to distract the French populace from their misery at home.
The sources highlight his disastrous expedition to Mexico in the early 1860s as the prime example of this.
Oh, man.
It was a blatant, unprovoked colonial intervention. Ostensibly launched to collect debts, its real purpose was to assist European financial speculators, establish a puppet empire in the Americas to counter the United States, and drape Napoleon III in the borrowed military glory of his uncle.
Did it work?
No, it ultimately ended in complete humiliation for France.
And finally, we have to look at aristocratic Britain. They were the undisputed workshop of the world at this time. The architect of British foreign policy for much of this era was Lord Palmerston.
A very key figure.
Marx was so fascinated by Palmerston's immense influence that he wrote an entire series of articles ruthlessly dissecting his diplomatic maneuvers. Britain presented itself as this liberal democracy, but Marx argued it was actually governed by a bourgeois aristocratic oligarchy.
Their grand diplomatic strategy was singular. Maintain Britain's absolute industrial and colonial monopoly over the world market.
At all costs.
At all costs. And they achieved this through a staggering array of deceit, naval blackmail, and blatant interference in the internal affairs of smaller, weaker states. Palmerston was a master at provoking conflicts, setting rival nations against each other to keep them weak, and hypocritically claiming to be defending liberty and free trade while just ruthlessly expanding the British Empire.
Now, I want to push back on this diplomatic arrangement for a second, because looking at the geopolitical board they've laid out, the logic seems to contradict itself a bit. Well, Britain and France were locked in a fierce geopolitical rivalry with Russia. They were all competing for dominance in the world market, aggressively maneuvering for influence over the Middle East, the Balkans, and access to India.
Right.
If they were rivals, why did Marx and Engels repeatedly accuse the Western powers of secretly protecting the Russian Tsar? I mean, if Russia was the main obstacle to British and French hegemony, why not use their superior industrial and naval power to utterly destroy the Tsarist regime?
That is a great question, and that paradox gets to the absolute core of the diplomatic hypocrisy Marx and Engels were trying to expose. The Western powers, the elites running Britain and France, absolutely wanted to weaken Russia as a commercial and geopolitical rival.
They wanted to trim the bear's claws.
Exactly. They wanted to keck Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean and India, but they absolutely fundamentally did not want the Tsarist regime to collapse.
Because if the Tsar falls, who polices Europe.
Exactly the issue. It comes back to the sixth power, the revolution.
Oh, right.
The bourgeois oligarchies in London and Paris looked at the increasingly militant working class in their own industrial slums. They saw the Democratic and Republican stirrings across the continent, and they were terrified of a repeat of the massive 1848 revolutions that had nearly toppled every throne in Europe.
So they needed him.
They recognized that they needed the Tsar. They needed that massive backward Russian army as a dependable bulwark, an ultimate backstop to crush any future democratic or working-class revolutions in Europe, just as the Tsar had done for Austria and Hungary.
So the Western powers wanted to trim the bear's claws so it couldn't threaten their trade routes, but they desperately needed to keep the bear alive and well-fed to guard the gates of their own mansions against their own populations.
That's a perfect way to put it.
They feared the collapse of the conservative aristocratic order in Europe far more than they feared the Tsar's commercial rivalry.
And we see this completely cynical, hypocritical balancing act play out in bloody, devastating detail during the defining conflict of the era, the Crimean War.
Okay, let's get into the Crimean War. Fought from 1853 to 1856, this war pitted an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire Turkey against Tsarist Russia. The public justification, the narrative sold to the populations in London and Paris, was that the liberal Western powers were stepping in to protect a weaker Turkey from unprovoked Russian aggression and to preserve the sacred balance of power in Europe.
But Marx and Engels' journalistic coverage of the war completely stripped away that ideological veneer. They exposed the war as a calculated sham.
A sham.
Yeah, they frequently referred to it in their articles as an incomprehensible war and a mock war. While British and French soldiers were literally bleeding to death in the trenches, their governments were actively using the conflict to deepen Turkey's colonial subjection.
How were they doing that?
Under the guise of defending the Ottoman Empire, the Western powers were systematically taking control of Turkish finances and directing its foreign policy right behind the Sultan's back. Turkey wasn't an ally. It was a pawn being carved up by its own defenders.
And the conduct of the war itself was just a monument to diplomatic intrigue and staggering military incompetence. Friedrich Engels actually took the lead on this coverage, functioning as a highly astute military analyst.
He was incredibly detailed.
He really was. He wrote dozens of articles for the New York Daily Tribune, dissecting troop movements, siege fortifications, grand strategy, and he absolutely excoriated the ineptitude of the Allied commanders.
Engels paid particular attention to the structural flaws of the British Army. He highlighted that it wasn't a modern, professionalized meritocracy, it was a rigid extension of the British aristocratic oligarchy.
This part blew my mind.
Yeah, the British military operated on an archaic caste system where officer commissions were literally bought and sold for immense sums of money. You didn't command a brigade because you had studied tactics or demonstrated battlefield brilliance.
You commanded a brigade because you were a wealthy lord who could afford the price of the rank.
Exactly. You just wrote a check.
Think about the mechanical consequences of that system when deployed to a massive theater of war. The sources describe routine and perfunctory training, immense confusion in issuing orders, and a complete systemic failure of logistics.
It was a disaster.
So soldiers weren't just dying from Russian artillery, they were dying in droves from cholera, exposure, and starvation in the freezing, mud-filled trenches of Sevastopol.
Just horrific conditions.
And they were starving because the aristocratic quartermasters who had bought their positions couldn't figure out the basic logistics of moving winter coats and rations from the ships to the frontline trenches just a few miles away.
And Engels was relentless in pointing out that this logistical disaster wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was the inevitable, fatal result of an oligarchic administration that entrusted vital, life-or-death military operations to men entirely destitute of elementary professional knowledge, simply to preserve class privilege.
Yeah, the French military performance wasn't spared either. The primary problem on the French side was Emperor Napoleon III himself.
Always trying to manage everything.
Yes, he was attempting to micromanage the war from his palace in Paris via the newly invented telegraph. He forced terrible, strategically unsound blunders upon his generals on the ground because he desperately needed a quick, highly visible victory to bolster his fading domestic popularity.
He treated the lives of French soldiers as entirely disposable political capital, ordering senseless frontal assaults just to generate glorious headlines back home.
The Crimean War perfectly crystallized how bourgeois foreign policy operated. Human lives were merely leverage in a grand diplomatic negotiation over market access and territorial influence. But Marx and Engels' critique didn't just target the warmongering aristocrats.
No, it did.
Some of their most scathing analysis was actually directed at the prominent anti-war movement in Britain, specifically the free traders.
This is a fascinating dynamic. You had prominent men like Richard Cobden and John Bright, who represented the rising industrial bourgeoisie, often called the Manchester School of Economics. They vehemently opposed the Crimean War, making these grand speeches about peace and international harmony.
Right, and from a modern perspective, we might assume they were the principled heroes of the story, like they're the ones standing up against the war.
Marx argued otherwise. He dissected the free traders' rhetoric and exposed a deep structural hypocrisy. They didn't oppose the war out of a genuine humanitarian pacifism.
Why did they oppose it then?
They opposed it because war is incredibly expensive. It necessitates higher taxation, it disrupts global supply chains, and it interferes with commerce. The free traders believed that Britain's industrial machinery was already so dominant that they could control the world market simply by outproducing and outcompeting every other nation.
So they didn't need the military muscle.
Right. They wanted the monopoly of the world market, but they didn't want to pay the massive military bill to maintain it.
So their high-minded philanthropy and stated love of peace was actually just a love for a cheaper bottom line and lower taxes on their factories.
Exactly the point Marx was making. And he highlighted a glaring, brutal contradiction to prove it. These same free traders who wept in Parliament over the casualties in the Crimea were simultaneously fighting tooth and nail against any domestic legislation that would limit child labor in their own English factories.
Wow, that is grim.
They vehemently opposed the Factory Acts that sought to restrict the working day to 10 hours. Their professed love for humanity and human life vanished the exact moment it threatened to reduce their industrial profit margins.
That is a devastating critique of bourgeois pacifism. You have the working class watching all of this unfold. They're watching the aristocratic ruling classes squander what Marx called the people's blood and treasure in these piratical sham wars in the Crimea.
Yep.
They see the naked hypocrisy of the anti-war industrialists who want peace abroad but total exploitation at home. And this realization leads Marx and Engels to a radical strategic conclusion. It wasn't enough for the working class to just fight for better wages or shorter hours within their own borders.
No, they had to take on the world.
Historically, the working class movement had been localized, right? Focused on immediate economic grievances, striking against a specific mill owner or forming a local trade union.
But Marx and Engels realized that as long as capital was organizing globally, and as long as the ruling classes were using diplomacy and war to divide the workers, a purely domestic struggle was doomed to fail.
This radical shift in strategy was formalized in 1864 with the founding of the International Working Men's Association, which is better known as the First International. Marx actually drafted the inaugural address for this organization, and it issued a very specific, unprecedented challenge to the workers of Europe and America.
What did it challenge them to do?
It urged the working class to master the mysteries of international politics, to watch the diplomatic acts of their respective governments closely, and to counteract them, if necessary, by all means in their power.
It was a call to arms for an independent, proletarian foreign policy. While bourgeois diplomacy relied on deceit, secret treaties, and the cynical manipulation of the balance of power, the working class was instructed to base its foreign policy on what Marx called the simple laws of morals and justice.
I want to examine that phrase for a second, morals and justice, because in the context of Marxist theory, which is usually grounded in, harsh materialist economics, appealing to morals can sound surprisingly idealistic. Almost naive.
It does sound idealistic on the surface, but Marx was actually using it in a highly practical, strategic sense. In this context, morals and justice meant international solidarity.
Okay.
It meant recognizing that the emancipation of labor couldn't happen if workers in one country allowed themselves to be used as tools to oppress workers in another country. It was about breaking the cycle of national chauvinism that the elites used to divide the working class.
And we see the mechanics of this new proletarian foreign policy play out most dramatically during the American Civil War.
Yes, the sources spend a lot of time on the U.S. Civil War. The conflict breaks out. The northern states are fighting the Southern Confederacy, which is fighting to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, the British ruling class, the wealthy textile mill owners who rely entirely on cheap Southern cotton to run their factories, and the aristocrats who naturally sympathize with the Southern plantation owners as fellow landed elites, they want the South to win.
They want the cotton to keep flowing.
They want to intervene militarily on the side of the Confederacy to break the Union blockade of the cotton ports.
And the geopolitical tension reached an absolute boiling point in late 1861 during what was called the Trent Affair.
Oh, this was a massive crisis.
A U.S. Navy warship intercepted a British mail packet ship, the Trent, and forcibly seized 2 Confederate diplomats who were on their way to Europe to seek recognition. The British press, heavily influenced by Palmerston and the elites, whipped up a massive jingoistic frenzy. The British government actually began preparing for an aggressive war against the United States.
But then, the English working class steps onto the diplomatic stage. Because the Union Navy had blockaded the southern ports, the supply of cotton to England was completely cut off.
Right, the cotton famine.
The textile mills in Lancashire shut down. Hundreds of thousands of English workers were thrown out of work, facing genuine starvation and absolute destitution. It was a massive, immediate economic crisis for them.
And the British elites probably assumed these starving workers would demand that the Royal Navy smash the blockade to bring the cotton back, right? Like, feed us.
Exactly. Instead, they did the exact opposite. Despite their immense suffering, the English workers staged massive public demonstrations across the country protesting against any British intervention.
That is incredible.
They held town hall meetings, passing resolutions in support of Abraham Lincoln and the Union cause. They explicitly refused to let their government enter a war to defend the institution of slavery, even if it meant they continued to starve.
Marx covered these demonstrations extensively. He saw this as a glorious historic victory for the new proletarian foreign policy. The workers, acting completely independently of their government and against their own immediate short-term economic interests, essentially paralyzed the British ruling class.
Palmerston realized he couldn't launch a war against the U.S. if the entire British working class was in open revolt against it.
They proved that the working class could intervene on the world stage, counteract the secretive diplomacy of their rulers, and uphold those laws of morals and justice by striking a blow against slavery.
Another crucial structural test case for this independent foreign policy was what was known as the Irish question. Marx and Engels spent decades analyzing the relationship between England and Ireland, and it fundamentally shaped their understanding of international solidarity.
Marx strongly insisted that the English working class had to make the fight for Irish independence a central part of their own political platform, which, again, requires some explanation.
Yeah, why would they?
Why should a factory worker in London or Manchester prioritize the national liberation of Irish tenant farmers?
Well, Marx laid out the mechanics of this in a really brilliant formulation. He said a nation cannot become free and at the same time continue to oppress other nations. He observed how the English ruling class intentionally stoked anti-Irish prejudice among English workers.
How do they do that?
When impoverished Irish immigrants fled to England looking for work, the elites used them to drive down wages and then pointed the finger at the Irish as the cause of the English workers' misery.
It's the classic divide and conquer tactic. As long as the aristocratic landlords could keep the English and Irish workers hating each other, they would never team up to overthrow the landlords.
Furthermore, Marx analyzed the economic base of the British aristocracy. A huge portion of their wealth, power, and political influence was drawn directly from their ruthless exploitation of massive estates in Ireland.
So it was their piggy bank.
Exactly. Marx argued that Ireland was the aristocracy's weakest point. By actively supporting Irish independence, the English working class wouldn't just be performing a moral act, they would be striking a direct, fatal blow to the economic foundation of their own domestic oppressors.
So solidarity wasn't just like a nice idea. It was a mandatory strategic requirement for the revolution.
Right. It was practical.
So you have the working class movement racing against time, trying to build this incredibly difficult, borderless international solidarity. But the world market isn't standing still while they organize. As the 19th century draws to a close, capitalism is rapidly mutating into an even more powerful, even more dangerous form.
This transition is deeply analyzed in the later writings of Marx, and particularly after Marx's death in 1883 by Engels, who lived until 1895. They observed a massive structural shift in how capitalism functioned. The era of free competition, the world they originally analyzed, filled with numerous small and medium-sized manufacturers fighting it out for market share, was ending.
The sources describe a process called the concentration and centralization of capital. Basically, in the ruthless competition of the free market, the big fish eat the small fish.
It's inevitable.
Over decades, this leads to the rise of massive joint stock companies, sprawling trusts, and gigantic monopolies. Instead of 100 small steel mills, you suddenly have one or two colossal corporations dominating an entire branch of global industry.
This is the dawn of the era of imperialism, driven by finance capital. And rather than solving the inherent contradictions of capitalism that they mapped out earlier, these monopolies massively exacerbated them.
How so?
Because these gigantic corporate entities possessed unprecedented, almost unimaginable productive power. The volume of goods they could churn out was staggering.
But they inevitably hit the same structural wall, the limits of the market itself.
Yeah.
The globe is only so big.
Exactly. You run out of map.
The sources point out that the rapid extension of production was vastly outpacing the extension of the markets. The monopolies were quite literally running out of new places on the map to nestle and settle.
And when markets can no longer expand fast enough to absorb the colossal output of these monopolies, the economic collisions between the capitalist nations become violent and inevitable.
It's like putting a lid on a boiling pot.
Right. Engels, looking at these structural shifts in the late 1880s and 1890s, made some chillingly accurate predictions. He foresaw that the intense, desperate economic rivalry between the emerging industrial giants, specifically noting the United States breaking Britain's long-held industrial monopoly, alongside the rise of Germany and France, would lead to an unprecedented crisis.
What did he think was going to happen?
He predicted a frantic, militarized scramble for the remaining colonial territories in Africa and Asia, and ultimately the looming threat of a catastrophic world war of a scale never before seen.
Yet, amidst all this looming imperialist conflict and the terrifying concentration of monopoly power, there's one specific place on the geopolitical map that Marx and Engels looked to with immense, almost surprising hope for a revolutionary breakthrough.
They looked to Russia.
I mean, think about the irony there. Russia, the gendarme of Europe. The ultimate reactionary police state that existed solely to crush revolutions.
Yeah, it seems crazy.
How does that become the hope for the future?
It is the perfect illustration of what Marxist theory calls the dialectic. It's the idea that historical forces develop through internal contradictions, where a system eventually produces the very forces that will destroy it. The Crimean War, despite being a cynical, hypocritical sham orchestrated by the West, had a profound, unintended historical consequence.
It changed things inside Russia.
Exactly. The humiliating military defeat exposed the absolute rottenness, corruption, and economic inefficiency of the Tsarist regime.
The Tsar realized he couldn't compete with the industrialized armies of the West using uneducated serfs. The military defeat forced the regime to initiate sweeping reforms from above to try and modernize, most notably the emancipation of the Russian serfs in 1861.
But that emancipation didn't solve the underlying problems. It merely dragged the massive agrarian Russian empire headfirst into the vortex of the capitalist world market.
Right, it just opened them up.
It destroyed the old, static, feudal stability of Russian society, replacing it with massive, explosive internal capitalist contradictions. Landless peasants, rapid, brutal industrialization in the cities, and a newly forming, highly concentrated working class.
Marx and Engels watched this dialectical process unfold and heavily anticipated that a massive social revolution in Russia was imminent. And they understood that a revolution there wouldn't just be a local, contained affair.
Because if the Tsar falls, the gendarme of Europe is dead.
The ultimate backstop of conservative, aristocratic power in Europe vanishes. An internal Russian revolution would fundamentally alter the entire geopolitical map. It would remove the constant threat of Russian military intervention against democratic movements in the West.
And they believed a revolution in the East would serve as the spark, the immediate catalyst for a continent-wide proletarian uprising in the advanced industrial nations of the West.
So if we step back and look at the grand architecture of their theory, the ultimate historical irony is this. Capitalism, driven by its blind, desperate need for surplus value, was forced to create the world market just to survive.
Right.
But by doing so, by relentlessly linking everyone together from the London stockbroker to the Indian weaver to the Lancashire factory worker to the Russian peasant, it inadvertently built the exact singular mechanism that would facilitate its own worldwide dismantling.
That is the core synthesis of their analysis. The world market broke down local isolation. It socialized the process of production on a truly global scale, making everyone reliant on everyone else.
We're all in it together, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. It created a universal, interdependent class of workers. Marx and Engels argued that a socialist revolution wouldn't have to invent a global network from scratch. It would simply take over the immense global productive forces already linked together by capitalism.
But instead of running that massive global machine blindly, chaotically, for the private profit of a few monopolies,
A socialist society would run it consciously, rationally, and democratically to fulfill human needs.
it is a phenomenal sweeping framework for viewing history. We started by looking at the world market as a chaotic, expanding engine forcing humanity out of isolation. We saw how this necessitated global diplomacy, but a diplomacy hijacked by the great powers who used secret treaties, Palmerston's naval deceit, and sham conflicts like the Crimean War to protect their wealth and ruthlessly crush the democratic sixth power.
Yep, the ghost at the table.
And in response, we saw how Marx and Engels challenged the working class to drop their national chauvinism, master the dark arts of diplomacy, and form a united international front governed by justice, not profit.
It's a geopolitical vision that demands we look past the treaties and the rhetoric of politicians and focus on the underlying economic structures and the hidden class interests driving them.
And that framework leaves us with a final concept to mull over, one that I want you to take with you long after we sign off. There is a deep economic concept in these texts regarding labor. Marx noted that under capitalism, the physical work you do, what he calls abstract labor, only truly becomes social labor, only truly connects with the rest of humanity, when the commodity you produced enters that massive global web of exchange on the world market.
Meaning, the energy and time you expend working only validates its connection to the rest of the human race through the act of buying and selling on a global scale.
So look at the objects around you right now. Look at your smartphone. Look at the clothes you're wearing or the coffee cup on your desk. They are the physical embodiments of that global metabolism we've been discussing.
Every single piece.
The metals inside that phone were mined in Africa, the components were assembled in Asia, the software was designed in California, and it was shipped to you on a vessel flagged in Panama, financed by capital from London.
It's incredible when you really stop to think about it.
It is. If the 19th century world market made those early merchants into unwitting, profit-driven cosmopolitans, what does today's hyper-connected, instant communication, algorithmic global economy make us?
That's the real question.
Are we just passive consumers, forever trapped in a cycle of periodic, inevitable crises, watching modern diplomats and tech billionaires carve up the globe in the modern equivalent of those velvet-draped rooms? Or, because we are more technologically and economically connected than any generation in the history of the human race, are we finally positioned to realize the kind of conscious, interconnected, worldwide solidarity that Marx and Engels envisioned?
The world market built the stage and wired all the lights. The only remaining question is who ultimately gets to write the script.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the collected works of Marx and Engels. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking at the underlying structures, and we will catch you next time.